7 years of silence ended at her door. Derek Hayes stood before Grace Carter's house, the letter burning in his pocket like a fragment of the sun. His best friend James had pressed it into his hands on a battlefield half a world away, blood on both their fingers, whispering a promise Derek never understood until this moment. Grace had lived in the shadow of unanswered questions, her husband's final words locked away in Derek's guilt. When she read the worn paper, tears falling like rain on sacred ground, she whispered 2 words that changed everything. Subscribe to witness the revelation. The Georgia sun hung low over the small town of Millbrook, casting long shadows across the quiet street where Derek Hayes had been standing for 20 minutes, unable to move. His truck idled at the curb, engine ticking as it cooled, while his hands gripped the steering wheel with a force that made his knuckles white and bloodless. 7 years had passed since he made the promise, 7 years of carrying James Carter's final letter in the bottom of his duffel bag, wrapped in plastic and buried beneath uniforms he no longer wore. The paper had yellowed at the edges, despite his careful protection, the ink slightly faded, but still legible, still holding words that belonged to a ghost. Derek had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind, imagined every possible reaction, every word Grace might say. But now that he was here, parked 3 houses down from the white colonial with blue shutters, his courage had abandoned him completely. The neighborhood was quiet in that particular way small southern towns possessed, where the hum of distant lawnmowers and the occasional bark of a dog created a soundtrack of ordinary life. Children's bicycles lay scattered across front yards, and American flags hung from porches, stirring gently in the warm evening breeze that carried the scent of magnolia and fresh-cut grass. Derek had driven through this town only once before, 7 years ago, on his way to James's memorial service, but he hadn't stayed long enough to speak to Grace then. He had stood in the back of the church, uniform pressed and medals gleaming, feeling like an imposter among the grieving family and friends who had actually known James as more than a fellow Marine. The letter had been in his pocket even then, a weight that pulled at him like an anchor. But he had told himself it wasn't the right time, that Grace needed space to mourn, that he would deliver it when she was ready. But the truth Derek had carried like shrapnel in his chest, was that he had been too afraid to face her, afraid of what the letter might say, afraid of the question she would ask, afraid of admitting that he had survived when James had not. The guilt had grown over the years, becoming a living thing that wrapped around his ribs and squeezed until he could barely breathe, until every morning felt like waking up in a grave he didn't deserve to escape. He had tried to drink it away in dive bars across 3 states, tried to outrun it by moving from job to job, city to city, never staying long enough to form attachments or answer questions about the faded tattoo on his forearm that read Semper Fi in elegant script. But the letter followed him everywhere, a constant reminder that some promises couldn't be broken without breaking the person who made them. Derek's therapist at the VA had told him that survivor's guilt was normal, that many veterans carried similar burdens, that the only way to find peace was to complete the unfinished business that haunted him. So here he was, 35 years old and feeling ancient, his body still strong, but his soul worn thin by years of running from a promise he should have kept the day he came home. He finally released his grip on the steering wheel and flexed his fingers, watching the blood return to them in a rush of tingling sensation. The letter was in the inside pocket of his jacket now, transferred there this morning with the solemnity of a sacred ritual, and he could feel its weight against his heart like a second pulse. Grace's house looked peaceful in the fading light, the garden well tended with roses blooming in neat rows along the walkway, a wooden swing hanging from the porch beam, moving slightly as if pushed by invisible hands. He forced himself to open the truck door, the metallic click sounding impossibly loud in the quiet evening air. His boots hit the pavement with a solid thud, and for a moment he just stood there, one hand on the doorframe, the other unconsciously moving to press against his chest where the letter rested. A memory flashed through his mind, unbidden, visceral and sharp as broken glass. James in the desert heat, face streaked with dust and sweat, pressing the envelope into Derek's hands with fingers that trembled from more than just exhaustion. The words James had spoken were burned into Derek's memory, though he had tried countless times to forget them, had begged whatever God might be listening to erase them so he wouldn't have to carry their weight anymore. But memory was cruel and precise, preserving every detail with perfect clarity. The smell of cordite and sand, the distant sound of helicopters, the way James's eyes had held both fear and absolute certainty. Derek closed the truck door gently and started walking, each step feeling like moving through deep water, resistance building with every inch of forward progress. The houses he passed were lit from within, golden light spilling through windows where families were gathering for dinner, television sets flickering with evening news, lives being lived in all their ordinary, beautiful simplicity. He had spent so long on the outside of that normalcy, watching from a distance, that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to belong anywhere or to anyone. The number 47 was painted on Grace's mailbox in careful white letters, and as Derek turned up the walkway, his heart began to hammer against his ribs with such force, he wondered if she would hear it when she opened the door. The roses leaned toward him as he passed, their perfume almost overwhelming, and he thought absurdly that James would have liked this garden, would have stood here with his arm around Grace's shoulders, planning which plants to add next season, never knowing that there would be no next season for him. The doorbell chimed inside the house, a melody that sounded like church bells, and Derek's entire body tensed as he heard footsteps approaching from somewhere within. His hand moved involuntarily to his chest again, pressing against the letter as if to reassure himself it was still there, that he hadn't imagined the entire 7-year journey to this moment. The door opened slowly, revealing Grace Carter in the golden light of her foyer, and Derek felt something break open inside him at the sight of her. She was smaller than he remembered, more delicate, with dark hair pulled back in a loose arrangement that framed a face marked by the particular kind of beauty that comes from surviving great sorrow. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, grey-blue and deep, and they widened slightly with recognition, even though they had only met once, briefly, at a memorial service, where words had been inadequate and silence had been all either of them could manage. Grace stood in the doorway with one hand still on the frame, her expression shifting from surprise to something more guarded, a wariness that Derek understood completely because he had seen it in his own mirror for years. She was wearing jeans and a soft cotton sweater despite the warmth of the evening, and there was a smudge of what looked like paint on her left wrist, suggesting she had been working on something creative, something that required her to lose herself in the act of making. Derek opened his mouth to speak, but found that his carefully rehearsed introduction had evaporated, leaving him standing mute and helpless on her porch, like a supplicant before a shrine. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the sound of crickets beginning their evening chorus and the distant hum of traffic on the main road that ran through Millbrook Center. Finally, Grace spoke, her voice softer than Derek expected, carrying a hint of the southern accent that marked her as a native of this place. "Derek Hayes," she said. Not quite a question, but not quite a statement either. And he noticed how her fingers tightened on the doorframe, knuckles going white in a mirror of his own earlier grip on the steering wheel. "I wondered if you would ever come." The words hit Derek like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs because they carried the weight of 7 years of waiting, 7 years of unanswered questions, 7 years of a widow trying to piece together the final moments of her husband's life from incomplete reports and official condolences that said everything and nothing at all. He realized then that she had been expecting him, or at least hoping for him, That his absence had been another loss, layered on top of the first, unbearable one. Derek found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by emotion. "Grace, I'm sorry. I should have come sooner. I should have—" But she raised her free hand, a gesture both graceful and commanding, stopping his apology before it could gain momentum. "Don't," she said simply, and there was no anger in her voice, only a profound weariness that spoke of too many nights spent crying, too many dawns greeted with the hollow knowledge that James would never walk through her door again. "Just tell me why you're here now." Derek's hand moved to his jacket, fingers trembling as they found the inner pocket, and he saw Grace's eyes follow the movement, saw understanding dawn in their grey-blue depths like light breaking through clouds. She knew, somehow, without him saying a word, she knew what he had come to deliver. He pulled the letter out slowly, the envelope worn and soft from years of being carried, from being pressed against his chest during nightmares and held in his hands during long, sleepless nights when the guilt became too heavy to bear alone. The envelope was addressed in James's distinctive handwriting, bold and slightly slanted, the ink slightly smudged in places where Derek's own tears had fallen over the years. Moments of weakness when he had taken it out and stared at Grace's name written in a dead man's hand. "James gave this to me," Derek said, the words coming easier now, pulled out by the simple act of finally doing what he should have done 7 years ago. Before everything happened, he made me promise to give it to you, if he didn't make it home. Grace's eyes locked onto the envelope with an intensity that made Derek feel like an intruder in a moment too sacred for witnesses, and he saw her chest rise and fall with a deep breath, preparing herself for whatever words her husband had left behind. Grace reached out and took the letter from Derek's hand, her fingers brushing his for just a moment, and in that brief contact, Derek felt a current of shared grief pass between them, a recognition that they were both survivors of James's absence, both carrying wounds that would never fully heal. She held the envelope carefully, almost reverently, turning it over to see the seal still intact, preserved by Derek's careful storage and his inability to violate James's final privacy. "Would you like to come in?" Grace asked, but Derek shook his head, knowing instinctively that what came next was hers alone, that his role had been merely to be the messenger, the keeper of last words, and that he had no place in the intimacy of her reading them. "I should go," he said, already taking a step backward, retreating from the threshold of her grief. "But Grace, if you need anything, if you want to talk after—" He pulled a crumpled business card from his pocket, his current phone number scrawled on the back. "I'll be in town for a few days." She took the card without looking at it, her entire focus on the envelope in her hands, and Derek turned away, walking back down the path lined with roses, feeling lighter and heavier all at once, unburdened of his promise, but weighted with new uncertainty about what those words might unleash. Derek drove through Millbrook without seeing it. His mind caught in the moment Grace's fingers had closed around the letter, in the expression on her face that had been equal parts hope and dread. The town's main street was quiet, shops closing for the evening, their windows displaying handmade quilts and antique furniture, the kind of timeless Americana that existed in pockets throughout the South, like living museums of a slower era. He found himself pulling into the parking lot of a small diner called Maggie's, its neon sign flickering in the deepening dusk, and cut the engine without really deciding to stop, his body making choices his mind was too exhausted to question. Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and fried food, and a waitress, with kind eyes and a name tag reading Ruth, showed him to a booth in the back where he could sit with his back to the wall, an old habit from the service that he had never quite shaken. The coffee Ruth brought him was strong and bitter, exactly what Derek needed, and he wrapped his hands around the white ceramic mug, letting the heat ground him in the present moment. He had spent so many years living in the past, replaying that day in the desert over and over, like a film reel stuck on repeat, that being fully present felt foreign and uncomfortable. The day James had given him the letter had started like dozens of others, heat that pressed down like a physical weight, dust that worked its way into every crease and crevice, the constant awareness that danger could materialize from any direction without warning. They had been on patrol, a routine sweep of a sector they had covered countless times before, when everything had changed in the space of a heartbeat. In the explosion of sound and chaos that had defined so many moments of Derek's military service, James had been 3 feet ahead of him when the world erupted in fire and sound, when the hidden device that some unseen enemy had planted days or weeks before decided that this was the moment to fulfill its terrible purpose. Derek remembered falling, remembered the way time seemed to slow and stretch, remembered hitting the ground with an impact that drove the air from his lungs and filled his mouth with the taste of copper and sand. When his ears stopped ringing enough to hear, he had registered screaming, had realized with distant surprise that some of it was his own, and had forced his body to move despite every instinct screaming at him to stay down, stay still, stay safe. He had crawled toward James through the aftermath, through the settling dust and the acrid smoke that made his eyes water and his throat close, and found his friend on the ground, uniform torn and darkened with spreading stains that Derek's mind refused to process as real. James had still been conscious, still aware despite the severity of his injuries, and his eyes had found Derek's face with desperate clarity. "Derek," he had said, voice strained but surprisingly steady, "there's a letter in my vest pocket. You have to promise me you'll take it to Grace." Derek had been trying to apply pressure, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to do anything that might reverse what was happening. But James's hand had caught his wrist with surprising strength. "Promise me," James had repeated, and Derek had seen in his friend's eyes the knowledge that no amount of field medicine would change the outcome, that these were the final moments, and they both knew it. So Derek had promised, had pulled the sealed envelope from James's vest with shaking hands while shouting for the medic, while trying to hold his friend together through sheer force of will. James had smiled then, a terrible, beautiful expression of relief and resignation, and whispered, "Tell her I saw the sunset. Tell her I thought of her. Tell her—" But whatever else James had wanted to say was lost as his eyes lost focus and his breathing changed in that way that Derek had learned to recognize. The medic had arrived seconds later, had worked with frantic efficiency while Derek sat back on his heels, the letter clutched in his fist, watching as the person he had trusted with his life slipped away despite every effort to save him. The official report would later state that James Carter had perished from injuries sustained in combat, that he had been evacuated but had not survived transport. Clinical language that stripped away all the humanity and horror of those final minutes. But Derek carried a different report in his memory, one written in blood and dust and promises. One that included the weight of James's hand on his wrist and the look of absolute trust in his eyes when he had extracted that promise. The letter had become Derek's sacred charge, the physical manifestation of a bond that transcended death, and for 7 years he had carried it like a talisman, unable to let it go, but equally unable to fulfill his promise, paralyzed by guilt and grief and the terrible knowledge that he had survived when James had not. Ruth refilled his coffee without being asked, her presence brief and unobtrusive, and Derek realized the diner had emptied around him while he sat lost in memory. Through the window, Millbrook's main street was dark, except for streetlights casting pools of amber illumination. And Derek felt a sudden wave of exhaustion crash over him, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from finally setting down a burden carried too long. He thought about Grace in her house with the blue shutters, wondered if she had opened the letter yet, wondered what words James had chosen as his last communication with the woman he loved. Derek had been tempted over the years to open it himself, had held the envelope up to light, trying to catch a glimpse of the writing inside, but had always stopped short of that final violation, maintaining the seal as if it were the last honest thing he could do for his fallen friend. Now the letter was out of his hands, delivered at last, and Derek felt both relief and a strange new anxiety. As if by completing his mission he had opened a door to something unknown and potentially devastating. He left money on the table and walked out into the Georgia night, the air thick with humidity and alive with insect song. His motel was on the edge of town, a simple place with a flickering sign that read Pines Motor Lodge, and Derek drove there slowly, in no hurry, to reach the anonymous room that awaited him. As he pulled into the parking lot, his phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out expecting spam or perhaps a message from one of the few friends he had maintained contact with over the years. Instead, Grace's name appeared on the screen, her number lifted from the contact information he had provided, and Derek's heart began to race as he opened the message. It contained only 2 words, but they hit him with the force of revelation, with the weight of absolution he hadn't known he needed. Thank you. Derek sat in his truck in the parking lot of a motel in a town that wasn't his home, staring at those 2 words on his phone screen, and for the first time in 7 years he felt the crushing weight on his chest begin to ease, felt the possibility that redemption might actually be within reach, that promises kept could heal wounds that time alone could never touch. Derek didn't sleep that night, despite the exhaustion that weighted his limbs and made his eyes burn. He lay on top of the motel bed's thin comforter, still fully dressed except for his boots, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles and replaying Grace's message over and over in his mind. Thank you. 2 words that carried the weight of 7 years of waiting. 2 words that suggested the letter had contained something meaningful, something that mattered enough to warrant gratitude, despite the pain it must have caused, to read words written by a man who had known he might not survive, to speak them aloud. Derek wondered what James had written, what final message he had crafted in those quiet moments before the patrol that would be his last. What truths or confessions or declarations of love he had committed to paper, knowing they might be the last thing Grace would ever receive from him. The not knowing was its own particular torture, different from the guilt Derek had carried, but no less consuming, because now he had a stake in the outcome, a need to understand what his 7 years of carrying had meant. Around 3 in the morning, Derek gave up on sleep and took a shower in the motel's cramped bathroom, letting water as hot as he could stand beat against his shoulders and neck, trying to wash away not dirt, but the residue of memory. The phantom sensation of desert sand that sometimes still seemed to cling to his skin years after he had left that place behind. The mirror was fogged when he stepped out, obscuring his reflection, and he wiped a clear patch with his palm to stare at the face looking back at him. 35 but feeling 50, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before the war, a tightness around his mouth that spoke of words left unsaid and grief carried in silence. He barely recognized himself sometimes, wondered where the laughing young man who had enlisted with such certainty and idealism had gone. What series of moments had transformed him into this hollow-eyed stranger who carried other people's last words, like anchors around his neck? By dawn, Derek was sitting in his truck in the motel parking lot, drinking coffee from a gas station cup and watching the sky lighten from black to grey to the particular gold of early morning in the south. He had no plan for the day. No urgent reason to stay in Millbrook, but equally no compelling reason to leave, caught in a strange liminal space between the completion of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. His phone showed no new messages from Grace, and he resisted the urge to text her, to ask if she was all right. to demand answers about what the letter had said, because that felt like overstepping boundaries he had no right to cross. Instead, he drove back through the waking town, past the diner where Ruth was probably already brewing the first pot of coffee, past the small public library and the Presbyterian church with its white steeple reaching toward heaven, until he found himself on Grace's street without consciously deciding to go there. He parked in the same spot as the previous evening, 3 houses down, engine idling as he watched the white colonial with blue shutters in the strengthening morning light. The roses in the garden looked different at this hour, dew-wet and luminous, and Derek noticed details he had missed in the dusk. A small vegetable patch on the side of the house, tomato plants heavy with fruit, and a wooden bench under an oak tree in the side yard. The kind of place where 2 people might sit together on summer evenings and talk about nothing important. Grace's car was in the driveway, a sensible sedan in muted blue, suggesting she was home, though Derek couldn't see any movement through the windows. He sat there for nearly an hour, not quite stalking but not quite innocent either, caught in the gravitational pull of unfinished business, and the growing need to know what his 7 years of burden had meant, what transformation that letter had worked in Grace's heart that had prompted her middle-of-the-night message of gratitude. The front door opened at 8:15, and Grace emerged in running clothes, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, earbuds already in place. Derek watched as she stretched on the porch, a routine that spoke of discipline and habit, and then started down the street in a smooth, practiced stride that carried her away from where he sat. He debated following, then decided against it, recognizing the impulse as intrusive and inappropriate, the action of someone who had crossed from concerned to obsessive. Instead, he waited until she turned the corner at the end of the street, and then he drove in the opposite direction, heading toward the center of town where he could lose himself among strangers and try to sort through the tangle of emotions that had taken up residence in his chest. The morning was heating up quickly, humidity already thick enough to make breathing feel like work, and Derek found a spot in the shade of an old magnolia tree near the town square, where he could sit and watch people going about their lives. Mothers pushing strollers, elderly men sharing a bench and yesterday's news, teenagers with summer freedom written across their faces. Around noon, his phone rang, and Derek's heart jumped when he saw Grace's name on the screen. He answered on the second ring, trying to keep his voice steady despite the sudden rush of adrenaline. "Derek." Grace's voice came through, clearer than the previous evening, carrying less wariness and more something else that Derek couldn't quite identify. "Would you be willing to meet me? I'd like to talk about the letter, about James, about everything, I guess." Derek agreed immediately, too quickly perhaps, and they arranged to meet at 2 o'clock at a coffee shop Grace suggested, a place called The Grind that apparently served the best pecan pie in the county. When Derek arrived 15 minutes early, nervous energy making it impossible to wait any longer, he found a quiet corner table and ordered coffee he didn't need, his hands needing something to do, while his mind raced through possible conversations and revelations, preparing himself for whatever truth the letter had contained, and Grace was now ready to share. Grace arrived exactly on time, and Derek stood as she approached the table, an old-fashioned courtesy drilled into him by his grandmother long before the Marine Corps had reinforced it. She looked different in the daylight of the coffee shop, more present somehow, as if the letter had restored some essential part of her that grief had stolen. She carried a worn leather journal under one arm, and Derek recognized with a start that it was James's, the same one his friend had written in during quiet moments on deployment, filling pages with thoughts and observations that he had guarded fiercely against anyone else reading. Grace set it on the table between them like an offering, her fingers resting lightly on the cover, and when she looked up at Derek, her storm-grey eyes were clear despite the evidence of recent tears, the slight redness around the edges that spoke of a night spent reading and crying and perhaps, finally, beginning to heal. "Thank you for coming," Grace said, her voice steady despite the emotion Derek could see just beneath the surface. "I know this must be strange for you. Meeting like this, talking about James after all this time." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts, and Derek waited, his coffee untouched and growing cold, his entire focus on the woman across from him who held answers to questions he hadn't known how to ask. "I want you to know that I'm not angry about the 7 years," Grace continued, her words deliberate and carefully chosen. "At first, yes, I was. I spent the first year after James died waiting for you to show up, convinced that there must be more, that there must be something beyond the official reports and the folded flag they handed me. When you didn't come, I decided you were either dead yourself or you had forgotten, or worse, that there had never been anything to deliver at all." Her fingers traced patterns on the journal's cover, unconscious movements that suggested this was a familiar object, one she had held many times before. Derek felt the need to explain, to justify his delay, but Grace raised her hand in the same gesture she had used the previous evening, stopping his apology before it could form. "I understand now why you waited," she said, and there was compassion in her voice that Derek didn't feel he deserved. The letter explained so much, not just about James, but about you, about what you both went through, about the bonds formed in places most people can't even imagine. She opened the journal, flipping through pages filled with James's distinctive handwriting until she found a particular passage, and then she turned it so Derek could see. "He wrote about you often," Grace said, and Derek felt his throat tighten as he looked down at words written by his dead friend. Casual observations about their friendship mixed with deeper reflections on trust and brotherhood and the ways war changed men. "He called you his anchor, said you kept him grounded when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control." Reading James's words after 7 years was like hearing his voice again, and Derek had to look away from the journal, blinking hard against the sudden burning in his eyes. Grace reached across the table and placed her hand over his, a gesture of comfort and connection that surprised Derek with its simple kindness. "The letter," Grace said softly, drawing his attention back to her face, "was unlike anything I expected. I thought it would be a goodbye, one of those heartbreaking final declarations of love that soldiers write before they go into danger. And it was that, partly, but it was so much more." She pulled the letter itself from between the journal's pages, the worn envelope Derek had carried for 7 years, now opened and revealing several pages of closely written text. James wrote about his regrets and his hopes, about the life he wished he could have had with me, about the children we talked about having, and the house we planned to build, and all the ordinary, beautiful dreams that war stole from us. But then Grace's expression shifted, becoming something harder to read, a mixture of pain and something that might have been peace. "He also wrote about you," she said, and Derek felt his chest constrict. "He told me that if anything happened to him, I should know that he didn't die alone, that you were there, and that you would carry guilt you didn't deserve, because that's the kind of man you are. He made me promise, through the letter, across time and death, that if you ever brought this to me, I had to tell you that he didn't blame you, that there was nothing you could have done differently, that his last thoughts weren't of regret, but of gratitude, that his final moments were witnessed by someone who understood, someone who cared." Tears were sliding down Grace's cheeks now, but her voice remained steady, strong with the conviction of delivering a message she had been entrusted with. "He wanted you to know that you kept his promise, that by holding on to this letter until you could bear to deliver it, you were honoring him more than any flag or medal ever could." Derek couldn't speak, couldn't form words around the knot of emotion lodged in his throat, so he just sat there while Grace continued, her hand still warm over his. "The letter changed everything for me," she said. "For 7 years, I've been frozen, unable to move forward because I felt like James's story was incomplete, like there was some piece missing that would make sense of his loss. When I read his words last night, when I understood what he wanted me to know and what he wanted you to know, something broke open inside me. The grief is still there. It will always be there, but it's different now, softer somehow, because I have his final gift, not just to me, but through me to you." She squeezed Derek's hand gently. "James forgave you for surviving, Derek. He forgave you before there was anything to forgive. Now you need to forgive yourself." The words hit Derek like a physical blow, like absolution delivered from beyond the grave, and he felt 7 years of crushing guilt begin to crack and crumble, felt the possibility of redemption open before him, like a door he had been too afraid to approach, let alone walk through. They sat in the grind until the afternoon light shifted and the coffee shop began filling with the after-work crowd, seeking their caffeine fix and escape from the day's demands. Grace had shared more from James's letter, reading passages that painted a picture of the man Derek had known as a brother in arms, but revealing dimensions of his friend's inner life that Derek had never fully glimpsed. James had written about fear and courage, about the moments of beauty found even in war's ugliness, the way sunlight struck ancient mountains, the kindness of strangers in villages they passed through, the bonds formed in extremity that transcended normal friendship and became something closer to family. He had written about Derek specifically, about conversations they had shared during long night watches, about the way Derek had talked about his own family back home and the life he planned to build when the war finally released its grip on them both. Grace closed the journal eventually, her fingers lingering on the cover as if reluctant to break the connection to James's thoughts and words. "There's something else," she said, her voice carrying a note of hesitation that suggested they were approaching territory even more difficult than what they had already covered. "James asked me to do something in the letter, something I've been trying to figure out how to accomplish for the past day." She met Derek's eyes directly, searching his face for something he couldn't identify. "He asked me to help you, to not let you carry his death as a burden, to be for you what you were for him. An anchor, a connection to life outside the darkness." Derek started to protest, to insist that Grace owed him nothing and had her own grief to process, but she shook her head firmly. "It's not about owing," she said. "It's about honoring James's last wish. But it's also about something more. Reading his words, understanding what you carried for 7 years, seeing the cost it took on you. I want to help Derek. Not out of obligation, but because I think we might be able to help each other." The suggestion was unexpected, and Derek felt himself both drawn to it and frightened by it, uncertain whether he deserved Grace's compassion or whether accepting it would somehow dishonor James's memory. They talked around it for another hour, carefully exploring the boundaries of what such help might look like, what it might mean for both of them to acknowledge their shared connection to a man who existed now only in memory and the ongoing impact of his absence. Grace spoke about the past 7 years, about learning to live with loss, about the small ways she had rebuilt a life that felt authentic, even though it would never be the life she had planned. She had returned to painting, something she had abandoned during James's deployment, and found unexpected solace in the act of creating beauty from color and canvas, transforming grief into something visible and somehow more manageable. Derek, in turn, found himself talking about his own 7 years of wandering, about the jobs he had held and abandoned, the cities he had passed through without seeing, the nights spent in bars trying to drink away memories that remained stubbornly vivid, no matter how much he tried to blur them. He talked about the nightmares that still came, though less frequently now, dreams where he was always too late, always just out of reach, unable to save James no matter how fast he ran or how hard he tried. Grace listened without judgment, without the pity Derek had learned to recognize and resent from others who tried to understand but couldn't, because she carried her own understanding of loss, her own intimate knowledge of how grief could reshape a person from the inside out. By the time they left the grind, the sun was setting, painting the Georgia sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost too beautiful for the weight of their conversation. They walked together through Millbrook's quiet streets, moving without destination, just needing to be in motion while they continued talking. Grace showed Derek the studio where she painted, a converted garage behind her house filled with canvases in various stages of completion, some abstract explosions of color and others more representational. Landscapes of places she had never visited but imagined with the precision of dreams. One painting in particular caught Derek's attention, a desert scene at sunset, all gold and orange and deep shadow, and he stood before it feeling like he was looking through a window into his own memory. "I painted that 6 months ago," Grace said quietly, standing beside him. "I dreamed about the desert, though I've never been there. Dreamed about James standing in the light of the setting sun, and when I woke up, I knew I had to paint it." Derek felt goosebumps rise on his arms, despite the evening's warmth, because the scene Grace had painted was eerily similar to the landscape where James had died. The same quality of light, the same sense of vast emptiness, broken only by rock and shadow. "Tell her I saw the sunset," Derek whispered, repeating the words James had spoken in his final moments. Words Derek had carried but never fully understood until this instant. Grace's breath caught, and she turned to look at him with wide eyes. "What did you say?" Derek repeated James's words, along with the rest of that final message, the pieces he had been too overwhelmed to deliver the previous evening. He wanted you to know he saw the sunset, that he thought of you, that his last conscious moments held beauty along with everything else. Grace's hand flew to her mouth, and tears spilled over, tracking down her cheeks in silent streams. "I didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. "The letter didn't mention the sunset, but I've been dreaming about it for months, painting it over and over, and I thought I was going crazy, that I was projecting my own need for meaning onto random images. But Derek understood now that it wasn't random, that some connection existed between the living and the dead that transcended simple explanation, that Grace's dreams and her painting were James's final gift, reaching across the boundary of death itself, proof that love could survive even annihilation, that messages could be delivered through means no one fully understood. They stood together in Grace's studio as full darkness fell outside, surrounded by her paintings and the lingering presence of James that seemed to fill the space like breath, like memory made visible. Derek felt something shift inside him, some fundamental realignment of understanding, as if pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving suddenly clicked into place. The letter had been important, crucial even, but this moment felt equally significant. This sharing of James's last words, combined with the evidence of Grace's unconscious connection to that final sunset, creating a bridge between past and present, death and life, guilt and forgiveness. "He's not gone," Grace said, and though the statement should have been absurd, James was as gone as anyone could be, 7 years in the ground at Arlington Cemetery. Derek understood what she meant. Not completely. Not while we remember him. Not while we honor what he gave us. Not while we live the lives he wanted for us. Derek nodded, unable to speak, and realized that for the first time since that terrible day in the desert, he felt genuinely connected to something beyond his own guilt and grief. Felt the possibility of a future that wasn't just running from the past, but actually building something new. something James would have approved of, something that honored the sacrifice without being defined solely by loss. Derek stayed in Millbrook for 2 weeks, though he had originally planned to leave after a day or two. The motel room at the Pines Motor Lodge became familiar, the water stains on the ceiling like old friends, and Ruth at the diner learned how he took his coffee without asking. He and Grace fell into a routine without planning it, meeting most afternoons to talk or walk, or sometimes just sit in comfortable silence in her garden while she worked among her roses. And Derek read from James's journal, learning about his friend through words written in private moments of reflection. The journal revealed James as more thoughtful and anxious than Derek had fully realized, showed a man wrestling with fear and duty, love and obligation, the desire to live and the willingness to sacrifice, all the complex contradictions that made him fully human rather than the idealized memory Derek had been carrying. They visited James's grave on the 2nd week, driving together to Arlington National Cemetery, where Grace had made the journey alone countless times before. Derek stood before the white marble headstone that bore his friend's name and dates, the gap between birth and death so small, containing an entire life lived and lost, and he finally said aloud the things he had been carrying in silence for 7 years. He apologized for living when James had died, apologized for taking so long to deliver the letter, apologized for all the ways he had failed to honor his friend's memory by drowning in guilt instead of celebrating the life that had been lived. Grace stood beside him, her hand finding his, and together they spoke to the stone and the man beneath it, 2 people bound by love for someone who could no longer answer, but whose presence felt palpable in the quiet morning air and the tears that fell like rain on consecrated ground. On Derek's last night in Millbrook, Grace invited him to dinner at her house, and he arrived with flowers from the grocery store. Feeling awkward and uncertain about this shift from afternoon meetings to evening invitation, from public spaces to the intimate privacy of her home. She had cooked something simple but perfect, pasta with vegetables from her garden, and they ate on the back porch while lightning bugs emerged in the gathering darkness, their bioluminescent signals creating constellations in the warm air. They talked about the future for the first time, about Derek's plan to finally settle somewhere instead of running, about Grace's hope to open a gallery for her paintings, about the ways they might stay in touch and support each other through the ongoing work of healing. Derek realized he'd been wrong to think delivering the letter would be the end of something, when in fact it had been a beginning, the opening of a door to connection and understanding he hadn't known he needed. Before Derek left, Grace gave him something, a small canvas she had painted during the 2 weeks of his visit. It showed 2 figures standing together watching a sunset, their faces turned away from the viewer, their postures suggesting both grief and hope, loss and renewal. "That's us," Grace said simply, "and it's also James, because he's part of why we're standing here together, part of what made this connection possible." Derek accepted the painting with hands that trembled slightly, understanding the gift for what it was. Not just art, but acknowledgement. Not just an image, but a declaration that his presence had mattered, that his 7 years of carrying had led to something meaningful, that redemption was possible even for those who believed themselves beyond its reach. He wrapped it carefully for the drive home, this physical reminder that healing was not betrayal, that moving forward did not require forgetting, that honoring the dead sometimes meant embracing life with all its messy, complicated, beautiful possibilities. Derek left Millbrook the next morning at dawn, his truck packed with the few possessions he traveled with, the painting secured carefully in the passenger seat like a companion for the journey ahead. Grace stood on her porch in the early light, raising her hand in a wave that held no sadness, only acceptance and the quiet strength of someone who had stared into the abyss of loss and chosen to climb back toward light. Derek drove away slowly, watching her in his rearview mirror until the street curved and she disappeared from view. But he carried with him more than he had arrived with. James's journal that Grace had insisted he take, the painting that would hang in whatever place he finally called home, and most importantly, the knowledge that promises kept could transform everything, that 7 years of burden could be lifted in a moment of shared understanding, that redemption came not with grand gestures, but in quiet whispers of forgiveness spoken across the barrier between the living and the dead. The letter Grace had told him on that final evening had contained one more instruction that she had waited to share, saving it for when the time felt right. James had written that if Derek ever delivered the message, if he ever found the courage to face Grace and complete the promise, then Derek should know he was released from his guilt, free to live the life that had been spared, to honor James not through endless grief, but through embracing every moment, every breath, every sunrise, with the gratitude of someone who understood how fragile and precious life truly was. Grace had looked at Derek with those storm-grey eyes and said, "He wanted you to be happy, Derek. That was his final order, his last request, that you forgive yourself and be happy. Can you do that?" And Derek, thinking about the painting and the journal and the 2 weeks of slowly learning to breathe without the weight of crushing guilt, had nodded and whispered, "I can try." That seemed like enough, like the beginning of something, like redemption's quiet whisper in the dark. As Derek drove out of Georgia and toward whatever future waited for him, the sun rising behind him and painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded him of Grace's desert painting, he thought about James's final words and realized he had been carrying them wrong all these years. "Tell her I saw the sunset" wasn't just about beauty in the midst of horror. It was about choosing to see light even in darkness, about finding meaning in the ending, about the way love persisted beyond every boundary, including death itself. The sunset James had seen in his final moments wasn't an ending, but a transition, and Derek understood now that he was meant to witness that same truth, to live in the space between day and night, grief and joy, loss and healing, carrying both the weight of what had been lost and the lightness of what remained possible. He drove on through the brightening morning, Grace's "thank you" echoing in his mind, alongside his own whispered gratitude, 2 words that contained multitudes, that spanned 7 years, and the distance between life and death, that proved promises kept could heal even the deepest wounds, that love, in all its forms, between friends, between lovers, between the living and the dead, was the only thing that truly endured.